the small country that stood against a giant. In the winter of 1939, as Europe was spiraling into the chaos of the Second World War, one of history's most unlikely battles began. On one side stood the Soviet Union, a superpower with millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and the ambition to expand its borders. On the other stood Finland, a small, recently independent nation with barely a fraction of that manpower, little equipment, and no guarantee of foreign help. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. The Soviet Union was a giant. Finland was a tiny northern neighbor, barely holding its place on the map. Many expected Finland to collapse in days, perhaps weeks. And yet, what followed would shock the world. This is the story of the Winter War, a brutal frozen conflict that lasted just over 3 months, but left a lasting mark on Finland's national character. It's a story of courage, loss, determination, and resilience. And it's the story of how a small nation became stronger than it looked, stronger than anyone had imagined. A fragile independence. Let's rewind a little, because to understand why the Winter War happened, we need to know where Finland stood before 1939. For centuries, Finland wasn't its own country at all. First, it was under Swedish rule for about 600 years. Then, in the early 1800s, Russia took over after defeating Sweden. Finland became what was called the Grand Duchy of Finland, basically an autonomous region under the Russian Empire. Now, that sounds fancy, but in reality, Finland had limited freedom. It had its own language, culture, and identity, but the big decisions were made in St. Petersburg. Then came the Russian Revolution in 1917. The empire collapsed, the Tsar was gone, and chaos reigned. And in the middle of that storm, Finland saw its chance. On December 6, 1917, Finland declared independence. Think about that. After centuries of foreign rulers, they finally had their own nation. But independence wasn't smooth. Right after breaking away, Finland fell into a civil war in 1918. It was Reds versus Whites, the working class backed by Soviet Russia against the conservatives and nationalists who were helped by Germany. The fighting was brutal, brother against brother, and although the Whites won, the scars ran deep. By the late 1930s, Finland was still a young nation. Imagine it, just over 20 years old as a country, with a population of about 3.5 million, not much bigger than a single big city today. They were still building their economy, still shaping their politics, still figuring out who they were. And right next door sat the Soviet Union, a massive, paranoid superpower led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin didn't like the idea of this small, independent Finland on his border, especially because the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, was only 32 kilometers away. To him, Finland wasn't just a neighbor. It was a potential threat. That's the tension that set the stage. The young, fragile nation desperate to hold on to independence, and a giant next door that believed it had the right and the power to demand more. The giant versus the small nation. Now let's put this into perspective. By the end of 1939, when the Soviet Union finally decided to invade, the matchup looked completely one-sided. The Soviet Union was one of the largest military powers on Earth. They had millions of men under arms, thousands of tanks, and one of the biggest air forces in the world. When Stalin gave the order to move on Finland, he didn't just send a few troops. He sent almost 500,000 soldiers across the border right away. And more kept coming. Now compare that to Finland. Their entire army was less than 200,000 men, and many of those weren't professional soldiers. Some were reservists, some were ordinary citizens called up with very little training. On top of that, Finland's military equipment was outdated and limited. Let me give you the numbers. The Soviets had over 6,000 tanks. Finland had fewer than 30, and most of those were old models from the 1920s. The Soviets had thousands of aircraft. Finland had about 100, mostly small planes that were already years behind in technology. From the outside looking in, it was laughable to even call this a war. It looked more like a slaughter waiting to happen. In fact, a lot of foreign newspapers at the time predicted Finland wouldn't last more than 2 weeks. They thought the Red Army would just roll over them, plant the Soviet flag in Helsinki, and be done. But here's the thing. War isn't just about numbers. It's about preparation, morale, and knowing what you're fighting for. The Soviets were powerful, But their soldiers weren't exactly motivated. Many of them didn't even know why they were fighting. They were sent into freezing forests with poor equipment, bad leadership, and little understanding of the terrain. The Finns, on the other hand, knew exactly why they were fighting: survival. Independence was still fresh, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. They might have been outgunned and outnumbered, but they had something the Soviets didn't: unity, determination, and the home advantage. That's what set the stage for what happened next. A clash not just of armies, but of spirit. The spirit of Sisu. Here's where Finland's secret weapon comes in. Not a tank, not a plane, not some fancy technology, but something far harder to measure: Sisu. If you've never heard of that word before, don't worry. Even Finns will tell you it's nearly impossible to translate. At its core, Sisu means grit. It's the kind of determination that keeps you moving when every bone in your body says stop. It's stubbornness, endurance, courage, and resilience all rolled into one. And during the Winter War, Sisu became Finland's backbone. Most Finnish soldiers weren't professionals. These weren't lifelong warriors with polished uniforms. Many were farmers, hunters, loggers, ordinary men who just weeks earlier had been chopping wood or tending fields. When the Soviets invaded, they picked up their rifles, often their own personal hunting rifles, and went to the front. They didn't have much. Supplies were limited, ammunition was short, and tanks were nearly non-existent. Some soldiers made do with handmade weapons or captured Soviet gear. But what they lacked in equipment, they made up for in spirit. Think about it. These men weren't fighting for Stalin or for some distant cause they barely understood. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their villages. Every inch of snow-covered ground they defended was theirs. That gave them a fire inside that no amount of Soviet propaganda could match. Meanwhile, the Soviets were at a huge disadvantage when it came to morale. Many soldiers were conscripts dragged from faraway parts of the Soviet Union. Some had never seen snow before. They were cold, hungry, and confused about why they were even there. Add to that poor leadership. Remember, Stalin had purged much of his officer corps just a few years earlier, and you had an army that was powerful on paper, but brittle in practice. So when the Red Army clashed with Finnish defenders, something unexpected happened. The smaller, weaker side didn't crumble. Instead, they dug in, fought back, and showed the world what Sisu really meant. This wasn't just a war of weapons, it was a war of wills. And the Finns, with their unshakable Sisu, were about to prove that determination can be deadlier than any tank. War on ice and snow. If you want to picture the Winter War, forget sunny battlefields or tank columns rolling across open plains. This was a war fought in a frozen wilderness, snow meters deep, forests stretching endlessly, and temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. It was less about who had more firepower and more about who could survive in that kind of brutal environment. The Soviets, for all their numbers, were not prepared for this. Their soldiers wore thin, dark uniforms that stood out against the snow. Their tanks often froze solid. Engines stalled, weapons jammed, and food supplies froze before they could be eaten. Soviet troops were marched into these conditions in long convoys, stuck to the roads, easy to spot and even easier to ambush. The Finns, on the other hand, turned the snow and ice into weapons. Many were skilled skiers since childhood. In Finland, skiing wasn't a hobby, it was a way of life. Soldiers in white camouflage could glide silently through the forests, strike at Soviet positions, and then disappear before the enemy even knew where the attack came from. They didn't fight head-on, they used the terrain like a shield. One of their most effective tactics was called the modi, which means a pile of firewood. Imagine a Soviet column stretching miles long through a narrow forest road. The Finns would cut it into smaller logs, surrounding and isolating groups of Soviet soldiers, then destroy them one at a time. No mercy, no rest, just relentless attacks until the enemy was broken. The results were shocking. Take the Battle of Suomussalmi. About 11,000 Finnish soldiers faced over 40,000 Soviets. On paper, it was impossible. But using skis, camouflage, and hit-and-run tactics, the Finns completely destroyed 2 Soviet divisions. The Soviets lost tens of thousands of men, while the Finns suffered only a fraction of that. And then there was Rote Road. Soviet convoys stretched for miles, trapped in the snowbound forest. Finnish ski troops struck like ghosts, ambushing, burning trucks, cutting the column to pieces. By the end, the road was littered with destroyed vehicles and frozen soldiers. These battles sent a message to the world. Finland was not collapsing. Against all odds, this tiny nation was making the Red Army bleed. The cost of war. Now, let's be clear. As incredible as Finland's resistance was, it came with a terrible cost. This wasn't a heroic movie where the underdog walks away without scars. Every Finnish victory was paid for in blood, frostbite, and exhaustion. The truth is, Finland was constantly running on empty. Ammunition was limited, weapons were outdated, and supplies were stretched thin. Many soldiers went into battle wearing homemade gear or using captured Soviet weapons. And when they ran out of options, they improvised. This is where the famous Molotov cocktail came in. You've probably heard of it. A glass bottle filled with gasoline with a rag stuffed in the top. Light it, throw it, and it turned into a cheap but deadly anti-tank weapon. The name itself was dark humor. The Soviet foreign minister at the time, Vyacheslav Molotov, had claimed that Soviet planes were dropping food to liberate Finland. The Finns mocked him by calling those bombs Molotov's bread baskets, and their firebombs? Molotov cocktails, a drink to go with the meal. With that mix of humor and grit, Finnish soldiers took on Soviet tanks with bottles of fire. But the bigger enemy was the cold. Imagine trying to fight in -40 degrees. Weapons froze. Food turned to ice blocks. Soldiers who didn't move enough risked losing fingers and toes to frostbite. Many froze to death before a bullet ever touched them. The Soviets suffered the worst of it since they were poorly equipped and didn't know the terrain. But that didn't mean Finland was spared. Every day meant more men lost, more families back home grieving. By the end of the Winter War, Finland had lost about 25,000 soldiers. For a small country of just 3.5 million, that number was devastating. Every village, every town felt the loss. And here's the harsh truth. For all of Finland's bravery, Stalin wasn't about to give up. He had more men, more tanks, more planes, and he was willing to throw them into the fight no matter how high the cost. So while Finland was winning battles, the question loomed, could they win the war? The world watches. While all this was unfolding in the snow-covered forests of Finland, the rest of the world was watching in disbelief. Remember, this was 1939 to 1940. Europe was already on edge after Germany invaded Poland. War was spreading, and here was tiny Finland standing toe-to-toe with one of the largest armies in the world, and not collapsing. Newspapers across Europe and America covered it closely. Finland became a kind of symbol, the little guy taking on the bully. People cheered for the Finns. They were admired not just for their courage, but for their creativity. Ski troops, camouflage, Molotov cocktails. It captured the imagination. And there was more than just admiration. Volunteers actually crossed borders to help. Sweden, which shared cultural and historic ties with Finland, sent over 8,000 men to fight, plus medical teams, supplies, and equipment. Norwegians and Danes also volunteered, and even some Hungarians made the long journey to join. In total, over 12,000 foreign volunteers fought for Finland. There were also promises of larger help. Britain and France talked about sending tens of thousands of troops, not just to aid Finland, but also as a way of opening a new front against the Soviet Union. But the reality of World War II politics got in the way. Germany had its eyes on Norway and Denmark, and Western leaders were hesitant to commit too much. In the end, those big promises never materialized. Then there was the League of Nations, the international body that was supposed to keep peace after World War I. The League actually expelled the Soviet Union for its aggression against Finland, which sounds like a strong move. But in practice, it meant almost nothing. Words didn't stop Soviet tanks. So Finland's situation was bittersweet. They had the world's sympathy, the headlines, and the moral high ground. But sympathy doesn't feed soldiers, and admiration doesn't stop artillery shells. When it came down to it, Finland was still mostly alone against the Soviet giant. And as the winter dragged on, that loneliness became heavier. Because no matter how clever the Finns were, the Soviets could always send more men, more tanks, more planes. And eventually, that sheer weight of numbers would begin to break through. The Peace of Moscow. After 105 days of bitter fighting, the Winter War finally came to an end in March 1940. Finland had fought with unbelievable courage, but the truth is, they simply couldn't hold out forever. The Soviet Union kept sending fresh troops, fresh tanks, and fresh planes. Finland, on the other hand, was exhausted. Ammunition was low, supplies were nearly gone, and the population was stretched to the limit. So when Moscow called for peace talks, Finland didn't really have a choice. They knew the terms would be harsh, but the alternative was complete destruction. The treaty that followed, known as the Moscow Peace Treaty, was painful. Finland had to give up about 11% of its territory, including the region of Karelia, which wasn't just land, but home to important industries and cities. Around 400,000 Finns, more than 1 in 10 of the entire population, were forced to leave their homes behind and resettle elsewhere in the country. Imagine that. Whole families, whole communities, packing up and moving because their towns were now Soviet territory. On paper, Finland lost. There's no way to sugarcoat it. They gave up land, resources, and thousands of lives. The Soviet Union could point to the map and say, "We gained territory." But here's the thing, and this is what the world noticed. The Soviets didn't get what they truly wanted. Stalin had expected a quick and total victory, maybe even the full occupation of Finland. That didn't happen. Despite overwhelming force, the Red Army was humiliated. They'd lost over 100,000 men, some say closer to 200,000, in what was supposed to be an easy war. And most importantly, Finland survived. They kept their independence, their government, their army, their identity, all intact. In that sense, even though they signed a painful treaty, Finland had achieved something extraordinary. They had stood against the Soviet giant and lived to tell the tale. That survival, costly as it was, became the foundation for Finland's strength in the years to come. Lessons learned. The Winter War ended with Finland bruised but not broken. And out of that experience came some hard lessons, lessons that would shape the country for decades. First, the military side. The war exposed Finland's weaknesses. They were under-equipped, undersupplied, and too dependent on outdated weapons. But it also highlighted what they did well: mobility, guerrilla tactics, and using the land to their advantage. After the war, Finland doubled down on those strengths. They built better fortifications, trained more ski troops, and made sure the next time, their soldiers wouldn't be left fighting with hunting rifles and improvised bombs. They also invested more in local weapons production so they wouldn't be as dependent on imports. Second, the psychological side. The Winter War gave Finland a new sense of national identity. Before, they were a young country, still figuring themselves out. But surviving the Soviet onslaught gave them unity. The word Sisu, that stubborn, unbreakable will, became not just a cultural saying, but almost a national philosophy. It wasn't just about war, it was about how Finns saw themselves. Tough, resilient, never backing down. There was also a political lesson. Finland realized it couldn't rely on the outside world. Yes, they had sympathy and admiration, but when it came to real, concrete help, they were mostly alone. That shaped their foreign policy for years. Surrounded by bigger powers, the Soviet Union on one side, Nazi Germany on the other, Finland learned the value of pragmatism. Survival sometimes meant making hard, even uncomfortable choices, but the goal was always the same: protect independence. And perhaps the most important lesson of all, the Soviets could be beaten, or at least resisted. The Winter War shattered the myth of the Red Army's invincibility. The world saw it, and so did Finland. They knew that if they stuck together, if they leaned on their resilience, they could hold their own, even against a giant. So yes, Finland lost territory. Yes, they buried tens of thousands of their own. But they came out of the Winter War with something far more valuable: a hardened spirit and the knowledge that they were stronger than they had ever realized. Legacy and modern strength. The Winter War didn't just end in 1940 and get forgotten. Its legacy shaped Finland for generations. You can still see the impact today. During the Cold War, Finland had to walk a very thin line. On one side was the Soviet Union, a giant that had already tried once to crush them. On the other was the West, Europe, America, NATO. Finland's survival strategy became one of balance. They stayed officially neutral, careful not to provoke Moscow, but at the same time, they quietly built ties with the West. It was a balancing act people sometimes call Finlandization. staying independent while living in the shadow of a superpower. Militarily, Finland took the lessons of the Winter War seriously. The country developed what's called a total defense system. The idea is simple but powerful. If Finland is ever attacked, the entire nation is ready to resist. Not just the army, but civilians, infrastructure, industry. Everyone has a role. Conscription remained a core part of the military system. Even today, many Finnish men, and some women, serve in the army for a period, making sure the population is always trained and prepared. Culturally, the Winter War became a symbol of Finnish toughness. That word Sisu still defines how Finns see themselves: patient, resilient, unwilling to break even under immense pressure. It's not just about war anymore. It shows up in sports, politics, even everyday life. When things get tough, Finns remind themselves, our grandparents faced the Winter War. We can handle this. And in recent years, that spirit has resurfaced in new ways. With global tensions rising and Russia once again aggressive in Europe, Finland decided in 2023 to join NATO. For many Finns, that was the logical continuation of the same lesson from 1939. Never be caught unprepared. Never stand alone if you can help it. So what started as a desperate fight for survival over 80 years ago ended up giving Finland a kind of permanent armor. Not physical armor of steel and tanks, but a mindset, one that tells the world, we may look small on a map, but don't underestimate us. And that's why, even today, Finland is stronger than it looks. Stronger than it looks. When we look back at the Winter War, it's tempting to focus only on the numbers. Finland lost 25,000 men. They gave up 11% of their territory. Over 400,000 civilians had to leave their homes. On paper, it was a defeat. But history isn't written only on paper. The real story of the Winter War is about survival, about a tiny nation standing against a giant and refusing to be erased. The Finns showed the world that strength isn't just about how many tanks you can field or how many planes you can send into the sky. Strength is also about willpower, about knowing what you're fighting for, and about refusing to surrender even when the odds are stacked against you. That spirit of Sisu, grit, determination, endurance, carried Finland through those frozen months of 1939 and 1940, and it stayed with them long after the last shots were fired. It shaped their politics, their military, and even their national character. Today, when people look at Finland, a nation of just over 5 million people, they see a country that punches far above its weight. And a big reason for that is the legacy of the Winter War. So yes, Finland may look small on the map, but as history proved and as Finns still believe, appearances can be deceiving. Finland is far stronger than it looks.